We are so back. Okay, that was a bit dramatic, but people seem to like my Amazing Spider-Man videos, and I'm sorry it took a while to return. I've been busting my balls trying to catch up on videos, and this series fell to the background, but fear not, I'm working on it, and soon enough it'll be more of a regular thing. Not super soon, but I figured some stuff out on my content schedule, so if you're waiting for this, thank you, and I'm sorry for the wait, though. It is now time to pick up back where we left off with part 3 of this series, this time covering Amazing Spider-Man issues 44 through 68, spanning the release of 1967 and 1968. Notably, this will be the first part entirely in the John Romita Sr. Stan Lee era, after the fairly brief but notable Steve Ditko run. Issues 44 and 45 make up a brief Lizard two-parter. Dr. Connors is working on an antidote for the rhino and his rhinoism, and reacts to it, once again making him the Lizard. Peter spots his wife crying, and when he asks what the deal is, he learns the Lizard has returned again. He follows Connors' trail, but has no luck finding him as Frederick Foswell decides to tail Peter Parker, sensing something weird happening with the guy. Peter is hanging out with Flash, Harry, and Gwen, and the group meets Mary Jane, who they are floored is not only very attractive, but also seems to know and like the dweeb Peter Parker, and Gwen gets jealous. The Lizard is committing crimes, climbing into windows, all things J. Jonah Jameson is happy to attribute to Spider-Man, who eventually catches up to him and fights him, but sprains his arm in the spar. Mary Jane asks Peter to chill, but as his and Spider-Man's arm are both sprained, he declines to hide out and lick his wounds till it heals enough that people don't draw the connection to the simultaneous injuries he has when related to Spider-Man. The Lizard returns to his lab, hoping to find his notes on the formula to make a reptilian army, but he is no longer smart, so he just kind of gets pissed and starts wrecking shit. Hearing of a Lizard convention in Philadelphia, Peter hops a train and hopes to find the Lizard, and he does. But Lizard has an army of lizards, and the group fights with Spider-Man, leading him to a freezer car down the train, freezing him long enough to give Connors an antidote, changing him back to normal and ending the arc. I really liked the covers on these, especially issue 45, which is such an iconic cover. These colors are just so killer and very comic booky. I like the stuff with Peter and his friends, most notably Gwen and Mary Jane's burgeoning rivalry for the affection of Peter, who is just kind of a schlub that somehow attracts women. It also, however, kind of causes Peter to have to weigh his options between the over-the-top party girl and the more reserved Gwen, creating this new love triangle in the series. Eventually, Peter decides Mary Jane is too wild for him and starts leaning towards Gwen, though we all know how that story plays out eventually. Of course, we get some Stan Lee trademarked melodrama, with Peter upset that it is so hard to balance being Peter and Spider-Man in this book. This is a fine couple of issues, but the ending is a little weak. Issue 46 sees a new introduction for the first time in a while and has some interesting status quo changes. Spider-Man bumps into the Shocker, a new villain who Spider-Man is having a hard time hitting since he can vibrate stuff with the villain running off. Harry invites Peter to move in with him as Frederick Foswell starts officially suspecting Peter is Spider-Man. Shocker goes back to his base and recounts his origin. They like to do this in this series for some reason. Basically, he was a bank robber that made a vibrating suit, turning old Herman into the villainous Shocker. Peter is nervous of proposing that he moves out of Aunt May's house, but by coincidence, her friend Ann Watson had invited her to move in with her too at the same time, so Peter is able to move in with Harry without being concerned, hopefully making his double life more manageable as well. Peter takes Mary Jane on a date, though that is when they learn Flash Thompson was drafted to the Vietnam War and will be shipping out soon. Peter notices Gwen is looking fine as hell tonight, but he has Mary Jane, and making the complex relationship harder, his pal Harry is also kind of dating Gwen now. Anyhow, Foswell almost catches Peter changing into Spider-Man since reports of the Shocker are coming out, but Peter tricks him by having a faux conversation with himself as Spider-Man. Anyhow, he confronts and defeats the Shocker and turns in the picture to J. Jonah Jameson. Peter and Aunt May move out of their home, though for some unexplained reason, Peter feels melancholy about leaving his dear aunt despite exciting moments ahead. Herman Schultz, or the Shocker, premieres in this issue, and while the Shocker is a consistent Spider-Man foe, he isn't one of the top dogs of his rogues gallery by any means. Shocker is also one of the less weird Spider-Man villains, perhaps as a result of his B status. Just 60 years of occasionally threatening Spider-Man. No crazy lore behind this guy. He hasn't died and returned a bunch. He's just a Shocker. That's it. Pretty simple. This issue is definitely more of a drama than villain arc. Shocker is okay, and we get two semi-brief but not terrible fights with the guy. The main beef are the updates to Peter's status quo. He and Aunt May move out into two separate houses. For one, Peter with Harry, May with Anne. For the first time, the duo wouldn't live together in the comics, and marking an end to that dynamic, though of course Aunt May isn't written out of the drama or anything, but the baby Peter shit kind of concludes in the main universe here. Harry and Peter are in a polycule with Mary Jane and Gwen Stacy. Okay, not really, but there is some partner swap dynamics going on. Peter wanting Gwen now, but kind of being stuck with Mary Jane, who he likes but is not very serious with. Flash getting drafted to Vietnam is pretty interesting, kind of dropping the bully angle, but also interjecting some serious topics of the late 1960s to a slight degree, which starts happening more and more around this time. I think this, in a lot of ways, is the issue that John Romita Sr. and Stan Lee got to set up their own status quo that would last for a good portion of their run. The issue cutting most of the high school era Peter ties in favor of bigger and better things. We definitely had some tastes of this before, but they really get the ball rolling, and the cast and characters are almost completely turned around from what we saw in Amazing Spider-Man 1 all those years earlier. It's a good issue, and Peter feeling a bit bittersweet about entering a new chapter in his life is a great ending, since I think readers at the time may have felt a bit melancholy about this monumental shift in the status quo. Honestly, I did as well. High school Peter in the cast at the time is so iconic, hence why it's adapted more than any other time period of his 60-year history. With that said, we are going into another iconic period of Spider-Man lore. Why do you think the films and TV shows adapt Mary Jane, Harry, and Gwen so much as well? Spoiler, it's because they're pretty cool. Issue 47 sees Kraven return for a one-off issue. This would later be revisited in Deadpool Volume 2, number 11. In the issue, he goes back in time with his sidekick Blind Al, and the duo see some events that happen here, with the cover being a unique take on the cover of Amazing Fantasy 15. Kraven believes that Green Goblin is dead, and as a result, he decides to go back to New York to try to collect payment from the man who originally reached out to him, Norman Osborn. Meanwhile, Peter and his friends are having a party for Flash Thompson, who is headed out of New York for the war in Vietnam, though as the party is being assembled, Kraven takes Harry, since he is unable to find Norman himself. Spider-Man follows and starts fighting Kraven, though Norman shows up and is captured, but seemingly knows nothing about Kraven due to his amnesia that he got fighting Spider-Man previously. Regardless, Spider-Man fights off Kraven, and Kraven runs out of New York once again. After all this, they do end up holding their party for Flash, with he and Peter deciding to kind of bury the hatchet as he heads off to the war. I like how Gwen and MJ continue to have their rivalry over the men in their little friend group, and Flash going to war party was good setup, especially since there is a good moment where Flash and Peter, who have been getting around much more by this point, shake hands and sort of bury the hatchet for everything that happened in high school. It shows Flash has grown up a lot, and I think it's cool that despite being a bully, his arc comes to a close, kind of accepting Peter, showing how much he's grown from the shallow bully we saw in the first issue of this series. Of course, Flash isn't totally gone, but he does leave the main cast at this point of the series. Kraven's story is secondary, but the fight is fun, and it's good setup for Norman to kind of confront his past identity once again as the Green Goblin. This is a solid issue, good drama, and just really monumental to the changing status quo. Issues 48 and 49 is a two-part arc following the Vulture, but also expanding a bit on the Kraven stuff from issue 47. Spider-Man is checking around the city to make sure Kraven has actually left town. Meanwhile, Adrian Toomes, or the Vulture, is dying following an accident. He gives a fellow inmate, Blackie Drago, the location of a spare set of Vulture wings he may be able to use to escape, though as Adrian dies, Blackie reveals it was all part of his plan and that he caused the accident in hopes to take Adrian's wing tech for himself. Adrian dies, and Drago manages to break out of prison, finding Adrian's wings and becoming the second iteration of the Vulture. As the new Vulture starts causing issues throughout New York, Spider-Man comes down with a cold, eventually meeting with Blackie and being beaten easily by the novice supervillain. The issue ending with Spider-Man beaten in the snow. He returns home in the following issue and is visited by Aunt May, Gwen, and Mary Jane, the women in his life stressing the hell out of him. This pisses off Kraven, who is still hiding out in town. He wanted to be the one to take Spider-Man out, so he is like, what the hell, bro? Vulture is taking advantage of this world without Spider-Man and is just going on a robbing spree, which eventually, however, brings him to odds with Kraven, who shows up to show him who truly runs New York. Peter gets up and gets dressed as Spider-Man, hoping to stop this brawl, showing up and winning simply because the two supervillains can't work together to save their lives, the duo taking each other out. Vulture getting downed by a tranquilizer, and Spider-Man easily beating the exhausted Kraven the Hunter. Peter goes home, but the doctor says he's all healed up at this point. The second Vulture, Blackie Drago, first appears here and is only briefly the Vulture. We learn in Amazing Spider-Man 63 that Adrian Toomes survived. We will talk about that in a little bit here. But Blackie swears off being the Vulture out of fear, and beyond that has made 3 cameos in all of Marvel history for the next 60 years. I thought this arc was decent, namely the idea that Blackie takes over from Toomes and the betrayal leading to Toomes' seeming downfall. The thing about Blackie is he is kind of just your common crook, and I think that's why they brought back the brilliant inventor Adrian Toomes, who's been much more involved in the role, more or less consistently holding the title since then. The snowy New York setting is pretty fun in all honesty. It's a nice, comfy, and calm aesthetic, and you can really see the team of the Amazing Spider-Man book hit their stride here. The John Romita Sr. stuff, in my opinion, being a bit more consistent than the growing pains we had of the Ditko era. Issue 50 through 52 is the Kingpin arc, introducing the famous Marvel Street villain Kingpin. Hold up a second on that. Issue 50 specifically being one of the most famous issues in Amazing Spider-Man history, with the much referenced cover, with moments from this comic being directly adapted into Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 2, though only elements. Spider-Man is starting to see people harass him, some New Yorkers taking the anti-Spider propaganda pretty seriously and attacking him for trying to help. Heading back to his apartment, he learns Aunt May is having another health crisis, Peter feeling guilty he hasn't been there for his aunt as much as he should. All this while he's got a big test coming up in school as his grades continue to decline. Peter starts getting really tired of being Spider-Man, and he throws out his costume, vowing to end his Spider-Man career. J. Jonah Jameson ends up buying Spider-Man's suit off of a kid who sold it to him, much to the chagrin of Peter, who also quits the Bugle to focus on studying, and because he can't just take photos of his own exploits anymore. Peter runs into a night watchman who needs help, and Peter does, thinking the man looks a lot like Uncle Ben, reminding him why he still needs to be Spider-Man. All this while Foswell is meeting with the Kingpin, hoping to take over crime from the new leader of New York's crime. Foswell being captured by the Kingpin in the process. If you remember, Foswell was originally introduced as the crime master. Anyhow, Peter steals the suit back from Jameson. Kingpin is planning his big takeover, though first he stops at the Bugle since he's getting hounded by the media for what he's doing. Foswell challenges Kingpin as well as Big Turk, but both are easily beaten by the crime lord. Jameson is captured and brought to Kingpin's hideout, but Spider-Man is on the trail. Spider-Man is also knocked out, and Kingpin brings him and J. Jonah Jameson to the basement of his lair. The two are tied up and placed beneath a death trap. J. Jonah Jameson and Spider-Man forced to work together to break out and stop the Kingpin. Back at the Bugle, Ned Leeds realizes Jonah is missing and heads after him, giving Betty some flashbacks of the dangerous situations her brother and Peter were put in, and hearing that Ned will be put in an equally dangerous position kind of annoys her. Foswell, now back to his villainous ways, hears of Spider-Man and J. Jonah Jameson's inevitable death and gets mad since it isn't what he signed up for. Not sure what he thought he was getting into, but whatever. I guess Frederick Foswell, the crime master, never killed anybody. Spider-Man's friends are happy to see Flash, who is on leave from the military, which reading these in sequence. That really didn't take that long, but he's shocked to hear that Peter is still dating Mary Jane. Like, bro, it's been like 2 issues. Seeing everything turn south, Kingpin escapes as Foswell investigates and finds J. Jonah Jameson, but gets killed trying to defend him, dying the good man he became after his brief relapse into crime. Despite Spider-Man working with J. Jonah Jameson to help him be free, Jameson continues his vendetta against Spider-Man, and Peter's like, fuck it, dude, I don't know what to do with this guy anymore. 2 major first appearances happen in this arc. First, Kingpin, who is now the main villain of Marvel's Underworlds, going to blows with just about every street-level hero, but most notably constantly coming to blows with Daredevil. He has also since appeared in numerous Marvel films and shows, having a prominent role in 2003's Daredevil film, the MCU, and in the Spider-Verse film. He's Crime Man, and surprisingly, despite being so long-running, nothing remarkably crazy has happened to the guy in terms of long-term retcons. Also, I am currently viewing the Marvel Netflix shows, which are pretty notable for featuring Kingpin repeatedly, so if you like this series, check out my reviews of all the MCU projects. I talk about Kingpin there as well. Joseph Robertson is also here for the first time and becomes J. Jonah Jameson's right-hand man from here going forward. He's sort of the straight man to Jameson's over-the-top antics, if that makes sense. Frederick Foswell leaves the Bugle's staff to become evil, then dies a redeemed man. This wouldn't be a permanent death since he was kind of brought back by the Jackal in the Clone Conspiracy arc in 2017. But ostensibly, he's written out of the series after a fairly notable run since he debuted in issue 10 and was pretty much a regular character since. I enjoyed this story arc. Spider-Man and Jameson joining forces was good, as well as Spider-Man briefly quitting, opening the door for Kingpin to jump into his operations and eventually becoming one of the most major villains in the Marvel Universe. I also like the moment of clarity Spider-Man has, saving someone who reminds him of Uncle Ben and keeping the hero moving to defend the city as he had all these years. Kingpin is threatening, and I like that he calls the shots but also gets his hands dirty, which is why I think he stuck around while people like Foswell started getting phased out. He is brutal and memorable and ruthless, which makes him perfect for the role he fills in the Marvel Universe. All in all, good stuff. Issue 53 through 56 is a Dr. Octopus arc. Spider-Man is still pissed off that he's been chastised by J. Jonah Jameson despite the fact they worked together during the Kingpin affair. Professor Miles Warren invites Peter to a science fair, and he invites Gwen, though Harry is a little peeved at Peter since he's feeling Peter's holding some secrets from him since he's never around, and Harry is answering all of his phone calls from his aunt and other callers. The military is showing off a new device at the fair, a missile nullifier, which is quickly stolen by Doc Ock. Spider-Man follows, but Dr. Octopus gets away. Doc Ock, looking for a place to hide out, answers a classified to room with 2 nice old women. I bet you can guess where this is going. They end up being Aunt May and Ann Watson. Later, Peter arrives to visit Aunt May, and Doc Ock is living there under her roof incognito. He changes into Spider-Man and attacks Doc Ock, but Aunt May faints from the shock of the whole affair, and as Peter helps her, Ock makes it off. But some seeds are planted here, since May found Dr. Octopus charming. Anyhow, the nullifier is back in police custody, and they're trying to transport it with J. Jonah Jameson and his son John 3 at odds, since J. Jonah Jameson thinks Spider-Man is a menace and John is starting to get annoyed how dumb his father is acting. Anyhow, Dr. Octopus steals the nullifier back and wants to rob a Stark munitions plant. Dr. Octopus shooting Spider-Man with the nullifier, giving him amnesia. Anyhow, Spider-Man starts committing crimes, convinced that he is a henchman of Dr. Octopus, and despite it feeling wrong to him, he decides to do it anyways. Ock tries convincing Spider-Man to take his mask off and show him what's under the hood, but Spider-Man figures he would know who he was if they were truly friends, and this caused Spider-Man to assume he was tricked, so he fights Dr. Octopus. J. Jonah Jameson shows up and shoots Ock with the nullifier, then tries to get Spider-Man to come with him and solve these problems, but Spider-Man, still stricken with amnesia, decides to flee the scene, which was probably for the best. The final issue in this arc sees the first appearance of George Stacy, Gwen's father, who ends up being a pretty consequential character to Gwen's arc, both pre and post-death, because, as we will cover, he, like Gwen, is killed, which was another of Spider-Man's great failures, and that's also a major tension point for Gwen. George Stacy is actually kind of important for a time, being an ally to Spider-Man and father figure to Peter, featuring pretty comprehensively until the character's death, despite that time being relatively brief. This arc is sort of weird. It is a series of odd plot lines. Doc Ock becomes roommates with Aunt May, transitioning into an amnesia plot, is a lot of story for one arc. The Doc Ock Aunt May connection is actually explored quite a bit for a time, and it's actually pretty thoroughly explored, though we will look more into that later down the line. Harry is pissed at Peter for never being around and being a bad friend, starting a new dynamic there with Peter's first platonic friendship in the series. This arc has a really weird, if convoluted plot, not totally uninteresting, and it sets up the brief amnesia status quo. I'm sort of mixed on the arc, but I do think the Aunt May and Dr. Octopus stuff, though hokey as hell, is kind of funny. Issue 57 guest stars Kazar, who is a really interesting character, kind of like Marvel's riff on Tarzan, I suppose. Basically, Spider-Man still has amnesia as Aunt May starts getting sick. Kazar comes to town and J. Jonah Jameson hires him to track Spider-Man, and Harry finds a spider tracer in Peter's office, Harry assuming that Spider-Man kidnapped Peter since Peter's been gone for multiple days. Remember, he has amnesia. Spider-Man hits the police station and seeks help since this whole amnesia shit is getting confusing. Anyhow, Spider-Man figures rationally he should talk to J. Jonah Jameson, but J. Jonah Jameson tries in vain to trick him into removing his mask, so Spider-Man again backs off. Kazar tries stopping Spider-Man, winning their battle, and Kazar takes Spider-Man to the top of a building to sort it all out, as Spider-Man's memory conveniently comes back with him explaining what went down. Kazar, satisfied by this explanation, leaves. Anyhow, now Smythe is in town and sets up J. Jonah Jameson with a new Spider Slayer, though as Smythe's intention to kill comes to light, J. Jonah Jameson thinks he is a psycho going too far and chooses to try fighting back. Spider-Man defeats the second Spider Slayer, and J. Jonah Jameson kicks Smythe out of his office as Aunt May heads to the hospital since she's still sick. This arc introduces the Spider Slayer Mark II, which is a little more Jack Kirby-ian than the original one made by Steve Ditko. The issues aren't bad, but I like Kazar enough and thought bringing him in was kind of fun, but J. Jonah Jameson wanting to stop Spider-Man then not wanting to kill him was kind of weird. Like, what's his motive? Why are you surrendering just to ensure that Spider-Man doesn't die? I guess I kind of get it, but J. Jonah Jameson is characterized like he should just let the project go on and not get in the way. His actual defiance to Smythe feels fast. Otherwise, it's pretty fun. I will say the Smythe stuff's kind of out of the blue, and I think just kind of was here because they resolved the Kazar stuff too quick. A small Kingpin arc takes place across Amazing Spider-Man 59 and 61 next. Peter meets Aunt May in the hospital and she isn't looking good. Peter meets Gwen Stacy and her father and explains the amnesiac Spider-Man kidnapped him, but let him free upon remembering that he isn't actually a villain. Gwen and Peter go to see Mary Jane at her job at the Gloom Room, a front for Gerard Winkler to brainwash people in his club, focusing mainly on New York's upper echelon, which includes Captain Stacy. As it turns out, this operation is operated by none other than Kingpin, who ambushes Spider-Man when he learns that Spider-Man's at the club, while he tries to save George Stacy, who's been brainwashed. Spider-Man is injured and gains double vision, disorienting him. Anyhow, the next day, Peter is less disoriented, and Peter goes back to talk to George, but George attacks him. Gwen walking in on him and George fighting, with George straight up gaslighting Gwen into thinking Peter decided to beat the shit out of him for no reason. Peter has images he thinks can tie Kingpin to the brainwashing and gives them to the Bugle, but this backfires since Peter's name is on the byline, and Gwen sees this, figuring Peter has it out for her father to her dismay, and that she's trying to slander him in the media after their fight. Anyhow, Gwen asks George, who is just snapping out of the brainwashing, and she somewhat learns the truth. The whole scenario putting George in the crosshairs of the Kingpin, who wants to kill the only witness, and the cops who think he is just a criminal. Elsewhere, Norman starts regaining memories of being Green Goblin, and he ends up confronting Winkler, who he learns was using the brainwashing device when he was created. Kingpin orders Peter's death for taking the pictures that were submitted to the Bugle, and George as well, since George knows too much. The men kidnapping Gwen and George, but Spider-Man with the help of Norman Osborn show up in time to confront Kingpin. During the scuffle though, Winkler is killed and Kingpin escapes, with Spider-Man saving the Stacys. The events of the issue and Osborn's testimony clearing George of wrongdoing and proving that he wasn't truly a criminal. This arc has some really campy moments, but by and large is actually pretty fun. I think the expansion of George Stacy as an ally and Gwen as a love interest is great and sets up a cool status quo for Peter. The gaslighting of Gwen when George is brainwashed was hilarious to me. That is such a hokey plotline. The brainwashing stuff was definitely campy, but Norman kind of remembering he is the Goblin and building up to his return was pretty cool. Building up the Kingpin as a major character in New York crime is really fun, though the Kingpin is still a hair undercooked at this point. Winkler is this comic's only first appearance, but he dies in the arc and never returns, so there really wasn't much to say. He is a function of the story more than an integral addition to the wider lore of Spider-Man. Amazing Spider-Man 62 is a one-off that features an Inhuman, the Inhumans being a group of characters that have been around for 4 years at this point and were still kind of being built up. A misunderstanding happens which causes Medusa of the Inhumans and Spider-Man to be at odds, though after the classic misunderstanding, Spider-Man learns Medusa is chill and on a mission for the Inhumans. Medusa is offered a hair campaign from a beauty expert as Peter tries making his relationship with Gwen work, which is still a bit on the rocks following the events of the Kingpin arc and her father gaslighting her while being brainwashed. Medusa hates the beauty industry eventually and starts getting frustrated, but to salvage the campaign, the beauty brand cooks up a plan to make Spider-Man and Medusa fight, which of course causes a good old misunderstanding fight once again. Fed up with the bullshit, Medusa returns home and Spider-Man tanks the ad campaign. This comic feels like a way to drive up some Inhumans hype, but I don't think that is the case exactly. They would never star in a book until Amazing Adventures Volume 2, where they starred as the main feature, with Black Widow starring as the backup feature. I say this because that book wouldn't drop until 1970, and this book came out in 1968. Perhaps it was an attempt to build hype, or perhaps the cover art was just considered interesting enough to expand into a full issue, but honestly, this book is kind of just a nothing filler issue. It's unique, kind of, but whatever. Issue 63 and 64 sees the return of the Vulture, Adrian Toomes, and concludes Blackie's brief run in the Mantle. This includes the retcon that showed Adrian's death was not actually his death. Anyhow, Adrian Toomes didn't really die, and he escapes from prison, grabbing his spare Vulture costume and vowing revenge on Blackie for what he did previously as the new Vulture. His first act was to steal back his suit from a museum that got possession of the suit, following Blackie's defeat previously. Peter is trying to patch things up with Gwen still, but to no avail. Vulture brings the spare suit to Blackie and challenges him to a duel to prove that he's the real Vulture. Meanwhile, Norman Osborn is still tortured by memories of being Green Goblin as the Vultures fight above the city. At first, Peter is kind of just content taking photos of the brawl, but soon is dragged in as the Vultures start causing collateral damage. Adrian knocks out Blackie Drago, proving his dominance as J. Jonah Jameson fumes that Peter ran off during the fight and couldn't get all the pictures. Spider-Man jumps into the fight to defeat the winner of the Duel of the Vultures, the duo fight, but during the fight, Spider-Man is grabbed by J. Jonah Jameson, who holds him down for the Vulture to beat, resulting in Joe Robertson getting injured. Meanwhile, Gwen learns her father was brain-controlled and Peter proved it, and that he didn't assault George for no reason during the Kingpin arc. leading to her wanting to apologize, showing up in time to watch the scuffle with the Vulture. Spider-Man is getting beat down, but short-circuits Vulture's suit. He is so run down that even with Vulture fleeing, he passes out in the street, totally beaten. This is a cool arc, really ties up the Blackie Drago saga, and honestly, Adrian is so much more interesting that I'm not too sad that Blackie was taken away, virtually to never return. I also enjoyed watching the duo fight. That was kind of fun. Gwen coming around to Peter is kind of nice, and we also get some flashes of Norman switching back to Green Goblin, which I think is pretty important. Yes, Toombs' return is a giant convoluted retcon, but it was the right move, honestly. He needed to come back. Blackie Drago wasn't gonna carry the Vulture identity as well as Adrian does. It's pretty solid, and the fight scenes are cool. Also, issue 64 with the sketch background is one of my favorite covers of the Romita era. I always really like the covers with the Vulture for some reason, though. Issue 65 is a really fun one-off comic, and one with another really cool cover at that. Spider-Man is picked up off the street after his fight with the Vulture and put into custody. Though his mask is left on, George Stacy ensuring that his mask would stay on till he was convicted of a crime or let free. Though upon arriving to the prison, prisoners happen to be revolting, holding Stacy hostage. Spider-Man is forced to get up and fight them off and save George Stacy. George urges Spider-Man to stay and clear his name, but fearing exposure, Spider-Man escapes prison to the dismay of J. Jonah Jameson. The fact that they wouldn't remove his mask is a bit of a convoluted way to avoid the revelation of Peter's secret, which is fine, but also like, why didn't you take off his mask? Otherwise, it's a fun one-off, and Captain Stacy remains a big side character and the only person of authority to back him, making his dynamic interesting in my opinion. It's a pretty good issue. Issues 66 and 67 feature Mysterio's return. Mysterio breaks out all of the prisoners, as J. Jonah Jameson is mad at Peter for dipping on the Vulture fight from the previous arc. J. Jonah Jameson kicking Peter out and refusing to give him money, though the other photographers don't take pictures at the level Peter does. Anyhow, Peter, low on cash, sells off his famous trademark motorcycle. While doing this, he sees Mysterio wandering the streets. Peter and Gwen make up, and they meet Harry, who is worried about Norman, who has gone missing. This compounded in concern as we learn that Norman is growing back into his goblin persona, and that he's starting to remember that Peter is Spider-Man as seen in Amazing Spider-Man 39. Peter visits Aunt May, but she's scared since Mysterio shows up on TV challenging Spider-Man, with Peter running off to answer that challenge. Spider-Man tries fighting Mysterio but is knocked down and comes to, appearing to be a small Spider-Man in an amusement park. Spider-Man fights through Mysterio's trippy trap as Aunt May's health declines, and J. Jonah Jameson is pissed that he doesn't have more on Mysterio. Gwen is visiting her father and hopes to hear from Peter after burying the hatchet with him, but it is Joe Robertson who is inquiring with George about Mysterio when his son asks for help. Anyhow, Mysterio and Spider-Man fight in a house of mirrors, and realizing it's all an illusion, Spider-Man defeats Mysterio as Joe Robertson learns of the ESU student protests, which is set up for the next arc. Randy Robinson first appears here. He is the son of Joe and is set up for the next issue. Eventually, he becomes kind of a major side character. He becomes friends and allies with people like Luke Cage, Misty Knight, and even becomes the roommate of Peter Parker way down the line. He is an on and off supporting character. This arc has some of the best art in the series to date. The Mysterio and Spider-Man fight and illusions are actually pretty fucking cool. Peter and Gwen bury the hatchet and kind of set the status quo back to where it was. Aunt May's health declines are back, and that's always good enough drama to get something going on there. This is a great set of issues and is some of the best stuff of the Romita era, especially since the illusion art is just really cool and would constantly be riffed upon moving forward with Mysterio's film, television, and video game appearances. Mysterio is probably my favorite Spider-Man villain, so it has to be a pretty awful story arc for me to dislike him. Alright, final issue of this part will be Amazing Spider-Man 68. It was recontextualized with a zombie Spider-Man in Marvel Zombies Return #1, which saw the characters under a zombie attack by evil zombie Spider-Man, which was kind of fun. John Romita did the general layouts and storyboards for this issue, with Jim Mooney taking over with art that very much looks to emulate John Romita. Kingpin is trying to steal an ancient stone tablet, learning it is being held at Empire University. Anyhow, the hall the stone is being kept in is being turned into dorm space for alumni, which makes students mad since there isn't enough housing for the students that are actually enrolled at ESU, leading to a protest, and Spider-Man meets with Randy, who explains that rent is too high, and rather than making low-income housing, they're just giving the space to alumni, leading to these protests. J. Jonah Jameson feels he should give Peter another chance, realizing no one else on staff can get the fire-ass pictures Peter does. Peter and Gwen visit Aunt May, who fakes feeling better than she is, so not to spoil Peter's mood, despite it looking grim for her. Josh, a friend of Randy's, riles up the students as they take over the hall. The cops start arresting students, but Kingpin shows up to take over the hall himself and steal the tablet. Spider-Man, hoping to capture the Kingpin to save face for the students who were arrested and prove their innocence, which we will look at in part 4. This issue is interesting. It has more than one black character, something that was rare for the day, and social issues, despite the issues being pretty simple that they presented. Regardless, social issues would start becoming a theme for Marvel around this time, especially the Spider-Man book. Peter doesn't care that much at first about the low-income housing, doesn't see it as a fight, but soon starts realizing that it is indeed a fight when Kingpin makes it off, framing the students for what he had done and getting a large amount of them arrested. The conclusion to that we will look at next time. It is interesting to see some real history here with these kind of 1960s civil rights protests, but Peter's passiveness feels a bit odd in hindsight. I don't know if this passive take impresses me that much, despite the issue still being pretty groundbreaking for its frank inclusion of black characters, not only in large numbers, but just pretty tastefully. But around this time too, we started seeing characters like Black Panther and Luke Cage, so it was definitely becoming more and more common within the Marvel Comics. Alright, well, that was part 3. Soon we will continue with more issues. I think this part had less groundbreaking stuff than the first 2, but the format of longer arcs is kind of the way the series works today over the old ways of single issues, which these longer arcs started kind of appearing here. Hell, the first couple of issues even had 2 features per issue, which was a very golden age standard, where you put multiple stories in each issue. Nowadays, several issues is the standard, and I think we're kind of starting to get a taste of that here. I think this allows for more character arcs. We see teases of more Norman as Green Goblin, for example, Gwen and Peter's relationship building up over whole arcs, George Stacy connections, Harry and Peter's roommate drama, and Aunt May's declining health are all major factors in this era and are all serviced by the longer arcs. In the next part, we'll look at the end of the first John Romita Sr. Amazing Spider-Man arc and move into the Gil Kane era of Spider-Man comics from there.